Is what we call reality nothing more than a hallucination? Hi, everybody. I am Dr. David Peña-Guzmán, and I am here to talk about this really interesting philosophical question with Anil Seth, a special guest that is with us today, who is a professor of cognitive neuroscience and also computational neuroscience at the University of Sussex, and also the director of the Center for Consciousness Science at the same university. Dr. Seth is the author of the book that we're going to be talking about in this interview, this amazing publication from 2021 called Being You, A New Science of Consciousness. Anil, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be talking to you.
Great. So I'm going to let you know that I've really enjoyed this book. I've been thinking about consciousness for quite some time, and I really appreciate the way in which you approach this question, not only in terms of positioning yourself relative to other schools of thought about consciousness, these other theories that are out there. We'll touch upon some of them, but also by charting this new way of thinking about consciousness that's anchored on the concept of hallucination for you. And so I want to begin by asking you about this concept of hallucination, because your book encourages us to move away from maybe this folk intuition that many of us have, that our everyday waking perception of the world is very different from a hallucination. In fact, you think that there are hallucinatory qualities or elements in everyday experience, such that the distinction between the two is not as clear-cut as many of us might assume. And you define, in fact, perception as a controlled hallucination. So to start thinking about this, can you just walk us through this line of thinking?
Sure, absolutely. The phrase controlled hallucination, the first thing I should say is it is not mine. I wish it was, but I borrowed it from, I heard it from a psychologist called Chris Frith, who borrowed it from somewhere else, and so on. But I like it for exactly the reason that you say, that it does mark out a continuity between what we typically think of as perception of the world and hallucination, which, in common language we use to describe situations where people experience things that are not really there, hear voices in their head, or see things that other people don't, or that don't exist. And it's typically thought of as a completely separate category. Now, the intuition, I think you rightly described this too, what you might call a kind of naive realism is you open your eyes in the morning, you look around, and there's the world. And you just see things as they are. And our senses merely open our brains to objective reality, and all these shapes and colors and sights and sounds and smells just pour into our minds, and we see reality as it really is. And this is a compelling intuition because it really is how things seem. I mean, when I look around me, it doesn't feel to me as though my brain has anything to do with it, unless something is really going wrong, or I've taken some psychedelic drugs or something. It just seems as though I see reality as it is. And indeed, in a lot of neuroscience textbooks, certainly the ones I used to read when I was starting as a student in the 1990s, a lot of these textbooks talk about perception in this kind of reading out the world way, a kind of outside in, bottom up way. Information comes into the brain and it percolates deeper and deeper into the brain. And it's kind of read out with increasingly complex aspects being picked out the further you get in. And there's other stuff going on too, but the intuition is still that perception is working in this kind of reading the world direction. But the view that I found much more, for me, interesting, and it's an old view too. I mean, you can trace it to Plato, you can trace it to Immanuel Kant in sort of German philosophy, you can trace it to Hermann von Helmholtz in the 19th century, the German physicist and physiologist. It's that normal perception is a kind of creative, generative act. The sensory signals that come into our eyes and our ears aren't read out to form this internal kind of movie picture of the world. Rather, the brain is always trying to make its best guess about the causes of the sensory signals. And the sensory signals are used to basically calibrate the brain's inside out, top down best guesses about what's happening in the world and the body. So it's a real kind of inversion going on here. And so that's why I find the term controlled hallucination apt, because it shares this inside out generative component with how people normally think about hallucinations, that it's something that the brain is doing, not that the world is doing. But normal perception is also controlled. So it's very, very important part of it. That's why perception is useful. Our perceptual experiences normally are tied to the world in ways that are useful for us, that guide our behavior. That's why evolution has tuned our perceptual systems the way it has. So in this view, perception is a controlled hallucination. I think that's the right way to understand it.
Yeah, no, and that shift from bottom up, which is the classical naive realist view, to a top-down, prediction-driven understanding of how we relate to the world, I think is really helpful for us just to understand exactly that philosophical lineage that you're talking about, that a number of scientists and philosophers, Kant, you mentioned Plato, have really invited us to think about subjectivity as adding something to the construction of the world rather than being merely palimpsest, or these papers that get imprinted upon by a purely active external world. And when we put it in that way, it really foregrounds the creativity of the subject relative to the world. But one question that I have for you is precisely about the terminology that we use to capture that creativity, because here you have settled on the term hallucination, and I like it. I think it brings a lot of things together. But I'm wondering whether, on your view, we could also use another term for capturing that creativity. Could we say that maybe everyday perception is a controlled dream, or it is a reined in form of creativity where we emphasize that there is a generative component, but it's also not as if anything goes, right? In everyday perception, it's not a hallucination or a dream in the classical sense of those terms, where things are chaotic and anarchic, but there is more stability. So how much work is hallucination doing as a term in your thinking?
It's a great point. But by the way, I take a little bit of issue with the premise of the question, because many hallucinations are not sort of anything goes, random or disorganized. They can be very law-like, very regular, very realistic, actually, depending on their etiology, depending where they come from. And just to give you one more example of the intuition here, about how the word can characterize what can be an everyday experience, is when you look at the sky on a day when there's quite a lot of fluffy clouds. Sometimes you'll see faces in the clouds. You can see faces in the arrangement of buildings on windows too. They're not like actual faces, but we see something face-like. And the formal term for this is pareidolia, seeing patterns in things. And for me, this is a beautiful example. There's nothing chaotic, random about it. It's very regular. And what we're doing is, I think we're experiencing something of the under the hood process here, in which the brain is casting out this kind of prediction of face into the incoming stream of sensory signals to see where it fits, and does this with faces, because for human beings, faces are incredibly important. So I take a little issue with the premise, I think, and it's important because no word is perfect, and this is something I've always struggled with. When I've used the term controlled hallucination now for a number of years, firstly, people often forget that I actually say controlled as well, and just sort of misunderstand me as saying that everything we experience is completely made up and the real world doesn't exist, and idealism, basically. And I'm not saying this at all. No, the real world exists. You're not a descendant
of Berkeley.
Yeah, exactly. Or so it's, again, this is why I'm more, in terms of philosophical grounding, I'm much more with Kant and the idea of that there is a real world, the noumenon. We never can experience it directly, but what we do experience is intimately and adaptively related to it. But if we didn't use hallucination, sure, we could call perception as a waking dream, as some people have, or as as constrained creativity. But all of these things are also imperfect and they have other connotations, right? I mean, creativity is often thought of as something that is a bit more generative, that's it's novel, bringing something new that wasn't there before, which may not be the case in certain aspects of perception. And dreaming, shares some overlap too. I mean, dreaming involves, I think, some of the same predictive machinery that normal perception does, but it's also different in very many ways too from normal perception. So this is why I settle on controlled hallucination. But the thing is, they're all linguistic abstractions for what I think is really important, and what, as a neuroscientist, I spend a lot of time trying to understand, which is, what is the brain actually doing, in terms of how signals are combined, processed, transmitted, that we summarize linguistically as controlled hallucination. And the best idea here is, formally, the problem the brain faces is one of Bayesian inference. So, it's having to come to a conclusion, infer the causes of the sensory signals that it gets. And Bayes formalized this. Actually, Simon Laplace did all the maths, but it was formalized mathematically, and is basically a way of saying, given some data, some sensory signal, and some prior belief about the way the world is or the body is, what should I believe now? And the idea that's kind of what the brain is doing when it's doing perception. Given some prior expectation about what's going on and some new data, what is happening now, that's what we perceive. And then the question is, how does the brain solve this mathematical conundrum? And we know actually it's frankly impossible to solve fully, generally, analytically. So the brain is probably approximating it some way. Evolution just wants a shortcut that works. And that shortcut, or one hypothesis about this shortcut, is the theory that's broadly called predictive processing or active inference, which I, that's the theory I work with in the book. And the idea here is, at the core, it's very simple, that the brain encodes some sort of model of the world and the body, a generative model, we would call it in statistics. And it uses that to basically throw out predictions. It's trying to predict the sensory signals as they come in at various levels of the hierarchy in the brain. And all the brain has to do is try to minimize what you might call the prediction error. It's trying to update its predictions to suppress the prediction error, so its predictions match what's actually coming in. And it turns out, if you have a system that does this, it will approximate this formal problem of Bayesian inference. So and you can unpack this and get more and more complicated about it. But the back to your point, the issue is there's no single easy mapping from one of our familiar everyday categories, whether it hallucination or dream or creativity, that describes this process. And we can also use the word, I think, I'm always kind of annoyed when I hear in AI these days, people talk about language models hallucinating. And I think this is a real misuse of terminology, because if we say that a language model hallucinates, we are implicitly conferring on it the ability to have experiences, which I think is very misleading. We should better say that language models confabulate, which means making stuff up without knowing they're doing it. That's a much closer description. And I do think it matters because, I suspect the reason you asked me, because the words we use to describe the phenomena guide our understanding, our thinking about it in ways which we may not even realize.
Yeah, but I think also it's important to note that one of the problems with using any of these concepts is the history of the concepts, which is that we have inherited these terms like dreaming, hallucination, perception, hypnosis, whatever, to denote something that's cut off from the rest of our mental life. But what you're trying to do is name the thing that all those things have in common, this predictive processing that is happening and that is generating experience through a balance of the incoming sensations that we get, the sense data that we get from the world, and then the predictions, the top-down expectations that guide how we make sense of what we're confronted with. And so, since you've taken us in the direction of predictive processing, maybe I'll ask you here about the way in which you think about in the book, the way you think about hallucinations now in the more technical sense. Because you mentioned that hallucinations happen when there is a breakdown of mental priors, right? So we have these priors that we carry with us. Some of them are deeply ingrained in our cognitive architecture. Some of them are more recently acquired, so they're a little bit more flexible. But we have all these mental priors, and sometimes those mental priors sort of become too strong. They have too much force over our mental life, and then that's when hallucinations happen. So I want to ask you two questions about this. The first one is, how do you define mental priors, and can you give us some examples? And then secondarily, and related to that, what causes a particular mental prior to become too strong, such that it has this hallucinatory cascading effect?
Mm-hmm. I mean, very good questions again. Although, back to our previous point, I think this hallucination component is there all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So what I think happens when this process goes out of balance and maybe the priors get too strong is you can think of that as uncontrolled perception, by analogy with perception as controlled hallucination. So the point is, I always want to think about these things as lying on a continuum rather than completely separate categories of phenomena. But yeah, we can think about what's happening here. One of the certainly some of my original encounters with these ideas was from work by Chris Frith and Paul Fletcher. Frith is a psychologist and Paul Fletcher is a psychiatrist at Cambridge. And they were talking about predictive processing as a way to understand the transitions from hallucinations to delusions in psychosis. Now, in psychosis, say something like schizophrenia, a classic symptom is hearing voices. So this can be thought of as an auditory, uncontrolled perception, right? And we'll get to what might kick that process off. But once that process is underway, one thing that can happen is it can become self-entrenching. And this can be when, where things that may start off without being too noticeable can end up being quite profound and end up being labeled as manifesting a psychiatric condition in some sense. And again, this could be for many reasons, but one reason is that the brain is actively choosing what sensory signals it harvests. It's not just this passive, as you said, beautifully palimpsestic sort of neural multi-layered tissue that absorbs things. We move our eyes, we move our ears, we move our heads, we go on the internet, we search for the information that then updates our brain's predictions. And so we can sometimes search for information that confirms what we already are predicting and get into these kinds of self-reinforcing, self-entrenching cycles. So those kinds of dynamics very broadly can account for how things can get much stronger, even if they didn't start out being very much different. And then there's also an entrenching across hierarchical levels. So there's a classic example is again from schizophrenia. So it might start with auditory perceptual hallucinations, uncontrolled perceptions. People start hearing voices. But if the brain isn't able to resolve those prediction errors at the level of perception, then it will naturally, maybe one way to do it is to update some higher level structure, some cognitive belief structure about what's going on. So, oh no, the voice is real, but it belongs to the CIA, the TV, whatever it might be. So eventually, and that can entrench the perceptual hallucination because now the brain is got a cause. It's inferred a cause for what's going on. And of course, it's not true in some quite literal sense. But that is indeed why we then label it as a psychiatric condition. So I think a lot of the answers lie in the dynamics. Quite what kicks off the process in the first place. You can address a question like that also at the level of basic neurophysiology. And here there are lots of interesting questions about whether it's, imbalances in neurotransmitters like dopamine or other neurotransmitters, noradrenaline, whatever, that might affect this balance between how predictions are updated given sensory data.
Mm-hmm.
Functionally, if our brains are too quick to update predictions on the basis of new sensory data, then those predictions can start to go awry. They can start to lose their grip on their causes in the world. But I think there are many kind of basic routes to how that might happen.
Yeah, and I suspect it would be dependent on the specific nature of the experience in question, right? Where some of those mental priors become too strong, as you mentioned, because we pay more attention to them. It reminds me of an example that I spoke to Andy Clark about of lower back pain. Sometimes, and it's something that I suffer from a sports injury where, you have a little pain and then you start thinking about it more and more and more and more. And so that re-entrenches the sense that there's something wrong with your back. But in some cases, it's not just sensory, it's also that there is a cognitive explanation that is generated by you, as in the case of schizophrenia, where the best prediction actually becomes so complex that it starts overpowering and not just the sensory data, but even competing cognitive explanations for what is going on. So I really like that you are pointing to these various ways in which mental priors can take on almost this monstrous power, just in the sense of dominating and breaking down this maybe more nuanced balance between what comes into us from the world and what we generate as predictions. And in terms of the various aspects of our experience that we can think of through this predictive processing model, I appreciate you pointing out, that we cannot talk about hallucination in the technical sense, as I did a moment ago, since the whole point of this book is that experience is, in a sense, hallucination with various levels of control. And one chapter of the book that I want to talk to you about takes this in the direction of mood, affect, and emotion. And you essentially make the same argument, noting that our moods and our emotions should be understood as predictions. And I want you to say something more about that, because I think that will strike a lot of viewers and listeners as counterintuitive, because we tend to think of our emotions and our moods and our feelings as things that, like befall us and that happen to us without a lot of foresight, without a lot of prediction. And so can you explain to us the connection to our emotional lives and maybe, add an example to bring it to life?
Yes, for sure. Although I think it's interesting because in a sense, we experience emotions often as things that happen to us rather than things we do. But the same goes for our perception of the world too. We also intuitively might think it's just something that happens to us. So I think the way in which these experiences appear for the subject is not that dissimilar and is compatible in the same way. But let's dig into it a little bit more. I mean, my starting point for this, certainly in my own trajectory thinking about this, was I'd always been interested not only in how we perceive the world, but the experience of being a self. And the larger wrapper for this part of our conversation is that I don't think the self is the thing that does the perceiving. I think the self is also a kind of perception. So it's also then a kind of controlled hallucination. So then it's also a kind of brain-based best guess. It's a very parsimonious theory if you have one core mechanism that can explain many different facets of conscious experience. And emotion is part of selfhood, really. And emotion is something we feel as part of us rather than part of the world. But emotion, again, in old textbooks, is often thought of as something really rather separate. You have emotion, you have perception, you have cognition. These are sort of different categories of mental content. But I'd rather try and find what unifies them. And I think predictive processing provides the right language to think about that. the other part of that story is William James and Carl Langer. So they were very influential writing about emotion in the late 19th century in what was considered a counterintuitive way. Before them, it was typically considered that emotion would mediate in some way between perception of the world and action. So the example being, you go into a room or go outside, there's a big grizzly bear there or something like that, and you see the bear perceptually. This causes you to feel fear, and then it's the emotion of fear that sets in train all the physiological responses that allow you to run away very fast. Cortisol goes through the roof, heart rate goes up, and so on. So you sense, you emotionally respond, and then you act. And what William James and Carl Langer said was, no, it's probably not like that. And they argued that emotion was the perception of the physiological state of the body. That was the emotion. So in this sequence of events, you go outside, you see the grizzly bear. That is enough to set and train all kinds of physiological responses, cortisol, blood pressure, whatever. And it's the brain's perception of those physiological responses in the context of a bear being there that is the emotion of fear. So I always was quite influenced by this, and it explains a lot of things about, for instance, the context dependency of emotions. Your body can be in a particular state, but depending on the wider context, you could feel either, I don't know, excitement being on a very rickety bridge or fear. It's same state, different context, different emotion, which is very, I think, important observation. And then this fits really nicely with the whole predictive processing framework, because the James idea hadn't, in my mind anyway, sort of resided at this sort of box and arrow level. Here's emotion, here's cognition, here's perception. But what I started to think was there's this actually really smooth parallel between predictive processing applied to perception of the world and applied to perception of the body. Because the brain has to, it faces the same problem when it's trying to figure out what state the body is as it has when it's trying to figure out what state the world is. If you think about things from the perspective of the brain, it's locked away inside the skull. It's only has indirect access to the state of the body. So this led to this whole theory of what I call interoceptive inference, interoception being the word for perception of the interior of the body, the physiological milieu, the physiological condition, and made the hypothesis that what we call emotion is the brain's best guess of the causes of these interoceptive signals by analogy with predictive processing in vision, in hearing, and in other things.
And presumably the same thing would happen then in the case of interoception as in the case of externally driven perception, right? That there would be data, in this case about the state of the body, and then there would be a prediction, and then there would be potentially error signals, and then a re-updating of the prediction, so on and so forth, until eventually we land on an interpretation. And so your take here, following this Jamesian perspective, is that final, or at least like for the time being, interpretation of the state would be the emotion.
That's right.
And so one quick follow-up on this. One argument that I've heard against the Jamesian perspective is that the problem with saying that we have a physiological state and then our readout of that state is the emotion is that there might be many emotions that have the same or a very, very similar physiological state. So, for example, the difference between, in the case of the bear, maybe it's the same physiological state that we have when we're in panic, in distress, in fear, and in, I don't know what another similar emotion might be here. And so do you believe that in those cases, there would always be a difference in the physiological state, very subtle, that would explain the difference between all those emotional states? Or could different emotional states share an underlying identical physiological condition? And in those cases, how does the brain decide which emotion to settle on?
Really, really, really important question. Um, I think there are a number of ways to go here, and I'll try to do it very quickly. I mean, one is I think it's easy to underestimate the possibility of subtly different physiological states. I mean, we don't have very good fine-grained ways to measure internal physiological states. So I think it's quite feasible to me that actually patterns of interoceptive, kinesthetic, proprioceptive signaling might be fairly different for different emotions. We just tend not to see it or be able to measure it. That's one thing. The other thing is that there's I think a difference between interoceptive inference and exteroceptive, like vision and hearing inference, or broadly a difference is that when the brain is trying to predict the internal state of the body, it's not simply just to read it out and say, aha, this is in this state with blood pressure like this, blah, blah, blah. And this, I think, really is where I ended up in the book, where I didn't expect to go when I started out on this road over 10 years ago, which is that I think the reason the brain acts as a prediction machine in the first place is not to solve the problem inferring the outside world, but it's to solve the problem of controlling and regulating the interior of the body. If you can have a predictive model of something, this is a great way of regulating something, of keeping some variable where it needs to be, whether that's blood oxygenation, blood pressure, or something else. There's a whole tradition of cybernetics, the poor cousin of modern AI, really emphasize this, that brains are fundamentally in the business of keeping the body alive. That means regulating the physiological variables that need to be regulated to stay alive. And at a certain level of complexity, that may well entail having a kind of predictive generative model that's able to anticipate deviations and prevent them from happening. Like when you stand up from a chair, you don't faint because your brain is transiently increasing your blood pressure. And if you measured your blood pressure, it would stay the same, would move a lot less because of this anticipation of a deviation. So back to the question, experiencing an emotion can actually then change the body's physiology too. So it's a two-way thing. So you can start to get this divergence rather than just a passive readout of a physiological state. And then the last thing is, even if putting these aside, it may not matter, because I think a real advantage of the whole predictive processing framework over something like just Vanilla James, sounds like a pop star actually, Vanilla James.
It really does.
Is, or a film, wasn't it that Vanilla Sky? Anyway, well, I'm going down a bad rabbit hole there. Is that our perceptual experiences depends on the whole hierarchical stack of interpretations of some signal. And so indeed there could be different interpretations that are compatible with the same base sensory input. And we know this in other contexts, like in vision. We study things like bistable perception. There are things like letters may, we might perceive them as being different letters if they're slightly ambiguous and embedded in a word context or a sentence context, which is different. So for me, there's no deep mystery about this. I think it's actually a fascinating phenomenon to study, and it gives us an opportunity to probe into how emotions are formed from this balance of interoceptive signaling and the brain's predictive stacks that are layered on top of it.
Yeah, and so this connection between emotion, prediction, and then the autoregulation of an organism at a holistic level, I think brings me to a last question that I want to ask you, because it underscores a difference between living and non-living systems. When I think about machines, and there's a lot of discussion about machines and AI and large language models, as you pointed out, there are certain living dynamics that we don't find in them, including this self-regulation, self-maintenance, that is, according to many people in the philosophy of biology, a defining feature of the living and therefore the sentient. But in the book, you talk about what is now known as panpsychism, which is the school of thought in contemporary philosophy and neuroscience that maintains that really any kind of complex system that integrates information beyond its individual parts is conscious. And you have some criticisms of this panpsychist view because you do want to limit perception understood in the way, or experience rather, understood in the way in which you've laid out for us, to carbon-based organisms. And so I wanna hear you say a little bit more about what your concerns are about this panpsychist position that, basically everything in the world, including computers and atoms and storms and waves, are conscious, which, it's become a very sexy topic in metaphysics and the philosophy of consciousness, but it also pushes against some deeply held beliefs that many of us have about, where consciousness is in the world and where it isn't.
So let's start with panpsychism and kind of rein it back in, I think. And you're right, it's become a position that has its moment in the sun right now, I think. It's becoming much more discussed. I don't think it's becoming any more plausible, but it's certainly becoming more discussed. And there are varieties of it, right? So there's this sort of standard flavor of panpsychism, which says that consciousness is fundamental and ubiquitous. So it's not so much that computers can have it and cars can have it and storms can have it. It's more that it's part of the fundamental fabric of the universe, like mass or energy or charge, something like that. And it manifests in different ways in different systems. So this is an interesting flavor of like pure panpsychism, which is metaphysical, right? It's just like that's a claim about the nature of consciousness within our broader picture of the universe. And the problem is, for me, is like it doesn't really do any explanatory work. It doesn't tell you whether someone is going to lose consciousness under anesthesia or why, or whether they have a hallucination or not. So it's not only that it's not testable, which most metaphysical frameworks aren't, but it also doesn't lead to any testable predictions. Whereas a more standard materialist view, which says that consciousness is, broadly speaking, the property of matter, of physical stuff, does lead to testable predictions, even though materialism itself can't be tested. So in a philosophy of science perspective, I find materialism more useful because it's more progressive, you might say, as applying Lakatos to metaphysics. And so I have panpsychist friends who will always tell me that, anything you say sort of theoretically, well, that's completely compatible with panpsychism. And I will always say, well, yeah, but we wouldn't have come up with this idea if we would been, if we'd been working from the perspective of a panpsychism, because they have their own problems, like how do small conscious things combine to form a big conscious thing? Anyhow, so that's my issue with pure panpsychism. Then there are other theories. You mentioned integrated information theory. That's another theory which implies a kind of panpsychism. It doesn't start from it. It says that, okay, consciousness happens when something else happens, which in this case is integrated information of a particular kind. And the thing is, that can happen very widely in nature. Not everywhere, but it can happen very widely. And that's interesting and challenging. But to believe that, you've got to believe the theory is correct. If you believe the theory is correct, then you have to have some credence in its extension of consciousness quite broadly. But for me, this is one among many theories. This idea that consciousness is identical to integrated information. I'm not persuaded by it sufficiently to take its panpsychist implications very seriously. And so I think, I feel more comfortable being grounded in distinctions that have some sort of face value. So what do we know about consciousness? We know that it's present for intact adult human beings, awake, aware, and we know it goes away for these same human beings under states of profound anesthesia. I think we can say that consciousness like this is also not there in a table in the way that it is in a person. Even if panpsychically, all the quarks are conscious or whatever. There's a big difference, an explanatory relevant difference between a table and a conscious person. So that, I think, grounds us, like what explains that difference. And then really the dominant idea at the moment is that it's some kind of computation. That's been the language that's been used to the extent that it's become so polished and smooth that people don't notice it's slipping by when people say, oh, the brain processes information and consciousness is a kind of information processing. This to me is a massive assumption that is probably not true. And it's an overextension or over-reification of the metaphor that the brain is a computer. Of course, it's precisely this assumption that's licensing lots of people to make claims about AI and say that AI is or could be conscious. Very important AI people like Geoffrey Hinton said this just the other day, that AI is already conscious. I think he's totally wrong. But why would he say it? Well, it's because there is this dominant view that consciousness is a matter of information processing. This may be true, but I think there are many reasons why it probably isn't true. And very broadly speaking, the idea that mental states are forms of computation is on shaky ground the closer you look at what kind of thing a brain actually is and how far it departs from the sort of thing that a computer is. So just to finish, I know this has been a long answer, but for me then the open question is, the only other things that we have reasonable credence of that are conscious are other living creatures.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I think you're right that one of the biggest challenges that we're going to face in the near future, at least in the study of consciousness, will be figuring out how to disentangle new ways of thinking about consciousness, mind, and experience from this inheritance of computational thinking that we have reified and that we don't seem to be able to escape, and that we don't notice the degree to which it shapes the answers that we give to the questions that we pose. But Anil, this has been a wonderful interview and a great conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time. And to all of our listeners and viewers, I highly recommend Anil Seth's Being You, A New Science of Consciousness. You can find it at any bookstore, any library. Check it out and let us know what you think. So thank you, Anil, and have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you very much.